The 68, the world's favorite college basketball bracketology show. Every Monday and Friday at 5 p.m. Eastern, we are here to break down the chaos that is college basketball and tell you whether or not your team is in or out as of the day we are recording. Today, it's February 3rd. I almost just corrected myself and said January. I can't believe it's February, boys. The season is heating up, and we've got two experts here to break it down for us. We got Rocco Miller. We got Andy Bottoms. Gentlemen, first question for you today. Of all the various hosts that they bring into this very show, am I in the last four in or the first four out? Andy, what do you think?
I mean, I've only been on twice so far this year, and you've been the host both times. So I would be hard pressed to, clearly my favorite of the ones I've worked with so far this year. So I don't know
Rocco,
what more ringing
one seed
endorsement I can give you.
Are we one seed territory?
One seed territory, absolutely. I mean, I've only worked with three total, even between last year and this year, you, Kai, and Jim. So love all three of you. I got to hang out with you guys in New Orleans too. So extra A+ for that.
That's a scary memory. I'm not going to lie to you. Well, thank you for the kind words. I needed the ego boost on this Friday afternoon. Look, we are brought to you by Bet Rivers. You can find us on the Field of 68 YouTube channel. If you want to watch any of these episodes in full, you can go back there to do so. And also, if you're watching us live, jump in the comments section. We will answer questions from the crowd. This is your opportunity to get on the microphone and fire bracketology questions at two of the smartest guys in the bracketology space. What more could you possibly ask for? All right, today a little bird has told me that we've got some one seeds that you guys may agree on. But before we jump ahead and look at the consensus one seeds, I want to ask you about metrics because I'm confused. I've heard some guys on the Field of 68 network this week, Terrence Oglesby to throw a name out there, he's not too happy with the net. He's not too happy with the net because his favorite team doesn't look too good in the net, but still, some accusations have been thrown around that should we really be valuing the net over other elements of basketball itself, wins, losses, other analytics, KenPom, Torvik. How important is the net and where should we prioritize it in the mix of everything else when considering how to seed teams going forward? Andy, let's go to you first.
Well, thanks for throwing me that one first. You're, may soon be moving down the list here of favorite hosts. This is a question that's hard to really answer. I mean, the canned answer that the NCAA would give is that it's really just a sorting tool, is the terminology that they use, and it's basically a way to categorize wins and losses. It isn't like they go and take it and say, well, numbers 1 through 4 in the net are your one seeds, and so it's important. I don't want to downplay the importance of it because it does frame up how we look at who teams have beaten. And there are certainly, you can look back historically and say, hey, anybody below X point, you're going to have a really hard time getting in. Even as we go and look at teams to consider for the field, once you get, certainly out of the 70s, probably even ones in the 70s, you kind of got to, squint at a little bit to try to see if they have a good case. And what it attempts to do is bring into account all of those factors, right? The challenge is that it's an algorithm and it's not like the RPI where somebody could go and recreate it before. So even if you hated the RPI, you could see how it worked and you could do all those things. So I think a little bit of it is the unknown, making it difficult because you can't really draw a firm conclusion of, oh, if this happens on the court, I know the net will do this. And I think that's what makes it a little bit challenging, at least for us as we look at it. But it does take into account some of the efficiency metrics and all that. So it does take into account things like that, similar to what KenPom would look at, and things like that. So I'll let Rocco dive into it more. I don't want to ramble on, so we'll take turns kind of talking about it. But that's at least my first blush answer.
No, that's a great start, Andy. I think you framed it up very well by saying the NCAA would want us to talk about it that way. I think for a common fan or a common even coach or somebody that covers the sport, best way to look at the net is prioritize that metric with your opponents. It's really there to judge how you did against certain opponents, right? And that's how we come up with how hard it is to beat a top 40 team. That's a quad 1A win if you do that in their building. If you beat a top 75 team on the road, that's a quad, a 1 or 1B depending on where they fall. I think the interesting thing about the net more from a basketball perspective, I talked to a lot of staffs about this, is, the net is comprised of strength of schedule, game results, location, scoring margin, offensive and defensive efficiency, and the quality of the wins is kind of their own definition, the NCAA's. My problem with it is you have scoring margin and offense and these efficiency metrics kind of getting double hit. So when you have a blowout, a team beats another team by 25, that's where I think you see a lot of spikes overnight. Team either getting drastically hit and losing 10 spots in the net, or another team skyrocketing 10 spots. It really, I think it's getting double hit in the net when you have those blowout situations. I think coaches are picking up on that too. You see so many late game scenarios now, Greg, where coaches will leave the starters in until the very end in an 18-point game. I see it all the time. I was at UCLA last night, saw it in that game. So anyway, I think it's created a whole different environment and a whole different coaching mentality on how they want to measure the end of these games. New Mexico, great example. Utah State game the other night. New Mexico was down 20 the whole game. They left their starters in and they only lost by 11. That helped them a little bit in the metrics.
Yeah, I think that's what you see in teams like, Houston and Tennessee. Everybody looks at them and they're rated high in the net. They don't necessarily have the number of quality wins that other teams around them do. But if you go look at how they've played people, they have just blown the doors off a handful of teams, and that helps, whether intentional or not. And I would agree with what Rocco said. You do see that more often in some of these games. I question how much that is the motivation in some of the buy game type scenarios, at least to a certain extent. But yeah, I mean, you get into these conference games and you're playing decent teams. If you can close that margin down, there's benefit in doing so. Now there's also risk in terms of risking guys getting hurt and things like that. But it explains a lot of the anomalies that you see when you look at a team who may seem generally less accomplished than other teams around it, but they still score really high in the net. And I think that's one thing that people can really call out about it and say, hey, this doesn't make sense because of these teams, and that's fair. But KenPom's also doing some of the same things when you factor in the efficiency metrics in that scenario, and there's plenty of examples of that over the years. And it's not like anybody's turning and walking away from that as an analytics tool by any stretch.
So I have a couple follow-ups for you guys. I don't want to spend the entire show just debating the merits of net rankings, because at some point we do need to unveil our bracket as of Friday, February 3rd. But my team, the Michigan Wolverines, last night went into the night with 0 quad 1 wins, came out of the night with 2 quad 1 wins, one from their own game where they beat Northwestern, and one from some movement where Maryland has now cracked the top 30 in the net rankings. Does that matter at all, like at this point, like with so much movement where things can shift, and maybe that can happen at the middle of March as well, but like for a team to go from 0 to 2 on one given night, is it just like too early to even be considering this? How valuable is it to really watch where teams are at now as far as projecting for where they'll be a month and a half from now, Rocco?
Yeah, I think you have to look at it. The best way to look at it, especially from a bubble scenario, is how many teams have you beaten that's actually going to be in the field. So today, both Northwestern and Maryland would still be in the field. So that's 2 wins against the field. I think that's way more important than any quad, because the committee, when you come down to those last 6 to 8 spots, it's all about who you beat, where you beat them, and all that, right? So it's going to be wins away from home. It's going to be wins against the field that are going to get you in the field. So I think from that standpoint, they already had the Maryland one in their pocket. They got the Northwestern one now. And now they've beaten Northwestern twice, haven't they? Do I have that right?
Yeah, 2-0.
Okay, so now they've got 3. So they've got 3 now. And I think that's the most important thing. The way I look at it is, if we're doing I have an entire different breakdown for the bubble than I do for the top half of the bracket. So for the top half of the bracket, I have 15 different categories that I track. And each team, I go team by team and I compare all of them. I don't put more weight on one than the other. Obviously, quad 1A wins are very important at the top of the bracket. When we get to the bubble, the most important things are who did you beat? Where did you beat them? What was your road record? How many road wins did you get in the top 2 quadrants? Because at that point, you're kind of searching for something positive, even if it's not a tournament team. If you go on the road and beat like a Syracuse or maybe a Temple or a Vanderbilt, some of these ones I'm looking at right now, those are still going to be meaningful when you're compared against a team that maybe doesn't have one, like a Kent State, for example, who doesn't. So, that's the way I sort it out. I have 17 categories for the bubble, and it's really just a beauty pageant. But a lot of times with that much information, it makes my decision making a lot more clear. And ideally, the committee gets that clear as well.
Okay, so my second follow-up for you, Andy, I'm going to throw a different spin on a follow-up at you here. So I want to use Ohio State as an example. They fell last night again. I think it was their 8th loss in 9 games now. They're 36th as of today in the net. Before last night, they were still top 30. They were 29th. They sit as of today at 11-11 on the season. And it's not just net that, like some other advanced metrics, have Ohio State pretty high comparative to other teams in high major conferences that have that record. Is there a point where this whole system could just totally break? Like, could we get a scenario where there's like a Big 12 team that goes 1-19 in conference play, but loses those 19 games by a point? And they're still a top 25 team. Like, are we in danger of that ever happening in this sport, or is that just too absurd that it'll work itself out?
I think eventually it just becomes too many losses. I mean, it would be interesting to kind of run through a scenario where a team, won or lost every game by a point, and kind of what it would look like, at least against top level competition. And then you kind of said, let's assume you blow everybody out in quad 4 by 30 points. And all the other games are there. And I think that's what you look at with Ohio State. They've got a 2-point loss to Purdue, 4 points to Rutgers. 9 to Illinois is not particularly close, 7 at Maryland, but some of these are road games where they've kept things relatively close, 3 at Nebraska and 5 against Wisconsin. And then all their quad 4 games, except for the Minnesota one they lost, I mean, they just have won by, I think they're all at least 20 points, most by at least 25, beat Cincinnati by almost 30 early on. And so you see some of those things, and eventually that's where the wins and losses still matter. I mean, you're not going to put Ohio State in because they haven't won enough games, period. They're 500. There's, history that looks back, and probably a conversation we can have when we talk about a team like Oklahoma right now, as you try to figure out what to do with them. They're 2 games over 500 right now. If what we're trying to do is project the bracket as if the season ended today, and when the season ends and somebody's 2 games over 500, they're not making it. So I think those things kind of take care of itself, but I do think it's a case where you can kind of throw the net up in front of somebody and be like, hey, look, if you're telling me, if you really truly wanted to use it as a rankings tool, and you're telling me Ohio State's the 36th best team in the country, I'm going to tell you that you're crazy, because they can't win games. And so I think there's validity to that argument about it. But again, I think to kind of circle it back to what we talked about initially, it really isn't truly a ranking tool. If it was believed in that it was that good of a ranking tool, then you wouldn't need to do bracketology. You wouldn't need a selection committee. You could just go and slot people in that way, which is not what's done. And I don't think what anybody is advocating for, or would advocate for anyway.
Yeah, I think with many of these, the keyword, as you referenced, is it's a tool. All of these things are tools. The more that you can use, the more information you can gather, the more different approaches that you can do to sort and rank these teams. In the end, the smarter you're going to be in trying to do so. And ultimately, these are all resources for smart people like you guys to tell us what the field is going to look like. All right, we've made the people wait long enough. I teased it at the top of the show. We have agreement. We have consensus. We have 1 seeds that Rocco and Andy are on the same page for. We'll pull those up for you right now. And then we'll just throw it to you guys to take us through this. Rocco, let's have you go first again. Anything relevant, anything jump out that would be worth noting with these 4 teams right now?
Yeah, I think the biggest notable difference from Monday is Kansas jumping back up to the 1 seed line. I think we have them 3rd in the pecking order. So the order right now should be Purdue, Alabama, Kansas, Arizona. I think that's what we're showing. So, and I think that's a testament to Kansas. 9 wins against the projected field, pretty incredible. Tied with Purdue for the most in the country. 4 of those 9 are in the quad 1A category. They have 9 quad 1 wins overall. And so, that's the most in the country as well. So the Jayhawks are just at a point where the sum of the parts are just greater than the teams are being compared against. I think the next 2 contenders for a 1 seed would be Houston and Tennessee. Houston and Tennessee have similar problems to where they have kind of a lack of wins against the field, but they have a lot of dominance against the rest of their schedule. Very high metrics, the top 2 teams in, the Ken Palm and the net itself. But I think the abundance of resume work that both Kansas and Arizona have done get them those 3rd and 4th number 1 spots right now.
Andy?
Yeah, I think as Rocco said, Kansas is the change from where we would have sat Monday. If you look at their upcoming schedule, before we hit Arizona, I mean, they got 3 of the next 4 on the road. A lot of these teams have 3 of the next 4 on the road, actually, but they go to Iowa State on Saturday, host Texas, at Oklahoma State. So there's, no bad losses to be had there. Eventually, though, if they take enough losses, they can play themselves off to one line. But in terms of raw number of quality wins and opportunities, anybody else is going to be hard pressed to catch up with where they are at this point if they keep playing well, and even padded that a bit with the win at Kentucky over the weekend. The last spot for me came down to Arizona and Houston. I think Tennessee feels like there's starting to be a little separation after losing to Florida this week. Arizona, what you like is 7 quad 1 wins, including 4 high quad 1 wins. They've beaten Tennessee, which head to head doesn't totally matter for this, but it certainly doesn't hurt to beat them. It was in Arizona, so that's worth noting as well. And really, if not for their, I guess weird is maybe the best way you could put it, losses, at least a couple of those, losing at Utah, losing at home to Washington State. If not for that, I think they'd be solidly on the one line. Just given they've got 11 wins in the top 2 quadrants, good non-conference strength schedule, 8-2 road neutral games, and really grayed out well there. Houston, as we talked about before, is the one that's a little bit hard to gauge. They had to come back and beat Wichita State last night, but the quality metrics, love them. They're first in all of those. Even the resume metrics are fairly good. 10-1 in the top 2 quadrants, but only 2 of those high quad 1 wins. Only one of these teams that's got they've got a quad 3 loss to Alabama or to Temple. And when you look, as Rocco said, it wins against the field. They beat St. Mary's on neutral court, won at Virginia. Those are both really strong wins. But outside of that, they have beaten some of the better mid-major teams that are going to be on that 12 seed line right now in Kent State and Oral Roberts. But outside of that, they just don't have as many opportunities. They played Memphis twice in their last 5 games of the season, and those are really short of being able to kind of pad some of their road wins and things like that. Those are really the biggest opportunities that they're going to have.
Yeah, so I want to pick at Houston a little bit. I'm glad you ended with that. So are they in a spot where they just need to hold serve and wait for these other teams on the one line right now to sort of just fall off, given the schedule they're going to play? Like, that's easier said than done, right? Houston had to come from behind just this week. But like, if Houston loses, let's say, one more game this season, would you assume that's enough for them to like, is there a number that they need to stay above the threshold on, or are they really just privy to whatever happens to those teams ahead of them that might have some bigger opponents down the stretch? What do you think, Andy?
I think they could lose at Memphis. I think that would be the most forgivable loss that they could take from here on out. It's hard to say because so much is dependent upon what goes on around them. I think while the numbers are still probably going to like them regardless, I do think that's important to know. I also think there's some subjectivity a little bit in it as well in terms of how people perceive them. They already are believed to be in a weaker conference, which they are. And so I think to take losses to teams that are not really going to be in the NCAA tournament picture just reinforces it will reinforce for those people who have that belief already that they're really not good enough. I don't know that that's fair, but I think that's reality to a certain extent. And had they maybe lost one of the other games that they won in one of the top 2 quadrants and not dropped a quad 3 home game, maybe that would matter. That game was only by 1 point, and they have a chance to go to Temple this weekend. If they blow them out, does that prove something? Probably does to a certain extent, but I don't know that there's a set number. I certainly think if they lose probably 3 or more, that feels like a pretty tall order, because at that point you've either gotten swept by Memphis or you lost at Memphis and you lost to somebody else that is not going to be in the tournament picture, at which point it gets pretty difficult to kind of overcome where they would be at that point. Now, if all the other 1 seeds drop a bunch of games, which seems relatively unlikely, maybe they allow themselves to be back in that mix, but they definitely are in take care of business, don't stub your toe mode right now.
Okay. All right. I want to end our 1 seed conversation with one little round robin quick hitter. I'm going to force you guys to, on the fly, make a decision here. I feel confident as a Big Ten guy saying Purdue will finish the season on the one line. I'm not worried about that. They just have such a gulf between them and the other teams in this conference. They've done such a good job building that resume, establishing themselves as the number one team in the country right now. The other three I could all see falling off. I think Alabama is pretty clearly number 2 to me right now, as we had them in the seed list when we brought the graphic up. You've got Kansas right there, and then you've got Arizona holding down the 4th spot right now. Pick one of those 3 that you feel the most confident will not be on the one line at the end of the season. I'm going to make you guys go from evaluating where we're at today to doing a little predicting for me over the next month. Let's start with you, Rocco, but who are you least confident will stay on that one line?
Yeah, it's a good question. I was at the game when Arizona got punished at Utah. I was in Salt Lake City for that one. And so just seeing them lose that bad, and then also seeing them lose by double figures to Wazoo at home, I do figure that when they come back to Pauley, they probably take a loss in that one. They might lose at USC. So I'll go with Arizona just because I love the system that Tommy's running, Tommy Lloyd. It's super effective against most of the teams they play. But again, they got blown out at Oregon as well. Avenged that loss last night. But I do think Arizona down the stretch, there's probably a couple more losses in there. And in the Pac-12, it's a little harder to make up for that. Kansas, I was tempted to say Kansas because they will probably take more losses, but they're also going to keep picking up amazing wins. So that might just keep them right there. So it's kind of hard to predict that.
Andy?
Yeah, I would say Arizona for the same reason. I mean, when you look at the teams who have taken head-scratching losses that are in contention for this, they are the one who stands out in that regard. So picking them is essentially not saying that it will happen again, but they've proven that it can happen to them. And really, when you look at, Alabama's schedule, there just doesn't seem like there's enough places there where they could really, now I say this, a week ago, they lost to Oklahoma by 24. I get it. But they go to Tennessee, they do go to Auburn. But a couple of the other road games are LSU and South Carolina, which are winnable, and then even Texas A&M to close out the season, who's been kind of up and down. So if you're looking for places that they're really going to potentially take losses, you'd look at road games first. And the Tennessee one is certainly a possibility in a game of contrasting styles there. But and then as Rocco said with Kansas, it certainly feels like they would have to lose. They would need to lose a lot, but none of the losses will be bad. But again, eventually the volume of them matters, to go back to our previous discussion. But it just feels like Arizona to me, even though realistically their schedule is the easiest of anybody's, I think you just, seeing that they've had blips here and there would make me lean their direction.
Yeah, that you mentioned Alabama's lost to Oklahoma. Bet Rivers, I almost had to close my account down. I could not live bet Alabama enough times during that game. It did not go well for me, just to say. Gamble responsibly, folks, out there, when you are betting with our friends at Bet Rivers. All right, let's move from 1 seeds to the bubble. A place that I feel uncomfortable just saying the name of, and I'm sure there are plenty of teams and plenty of fans out there that are starting to get a little nervy as we get into the second to last month of the regular season. Let's do our last 4 in. Andy, we'll start with you. Who are your last 4 teams in the field?
Yeah, so I had West Virginia, Kentucky, Nevada, and Wisconsin. The first 3 to me were relatively solid, I'd say, to put in as you look down those. West Virginia, another metrics darling on the quality metric side, at least. They average 25th there. They do have 5 quad 1 and 2 wins, or 5 quad 1 wins, 6 in quads 1 and quad 2. The oddity for them is they're 6 and 9 in quads 1 and 2. They played no quad 3 games, and they're 7 and 0 in quad 4. So a little bit goofy in that regard, but they rank in the top 25 in the net, have some solid wins, and so I think they are kind of teetering in that area where you're getting close to having too many losses or not being far enough above 500. And as you look at their upcoming schedule, it is rough. They at least get a couple home games, but they host Oklahoma and Iowa State. Then they go to Texas and to Baylor. So as we think about teams that maybe can or cannot take on many more losses, they're already sitting at 9 with that schedule coming up. Doesn't necessarily make you feel great, but they're at least the safest of these 4 for me at this point. Kentucky, often talked about in this regard lately. They've got the 1 win versus teams in the field. That win at Tennessee is awesome. But other than that, they've really only beaten Texas A&M, who's in contention. They did beat Michigan on a neutral floor. that helps a little bit. But that quad 4 loss to South Carolina looms pretty large for them at this point, although they have been playing better lately. So really just a chance for them to try to pick up some other high quality wins. They've got Florida and Arkansas coming up at home. So a chance to get teams that are at least either in the field or near the field in these next couple games. Then you go to Nevada, solid resume metrics with them. They're 2-5 in quad 1, 5-1 in quad 2, and no losses outside of those quadrants. That definitely helps. 6-6 road neutral works well for them, and they've already beat all the good Mountain West teams at home. It would help them to maybe beat, find a way to win at New Mexico, find a way to win at Utah State, to really have a good, road win against one of the upper echelon teams in the conference. But they've definitely taken care of business at home. And then Wisconsin was the one that I debated a bit. Them beating Ohio State last night really pushed them over the edge. Their overall, net that moved up to 68th with that win, but they're 36th in resume metrics on average, which helps them out. They've got 4 quad 1 wins, including 3 against quad 1A, 3 more in quad 2. So, solid resume there. And then you've got the Tyler Wall factor to try to consider, and the injuries. That's always a slippery slope with how you really want to consider those. As we've talked about a number of times on here, where you can't assume they would have won the games without him, but you also got to try to factor in the fact that he, could have made a difference in some of those games. So, they had at least that win put them in the field narrowly for me, and they've got a chance to get a little bit of momentum. They got Northwestern at home. They go to Penn State, which will be tough. Go to Nebraska, and then have Michigan, Rutgers, and Iowa at home all in a row. So a 3-game homestand here coming up before too long at the Kohl Center for them. So a chance to give themselves a little bit of breathing room or play themselves back onto the wrong side of the cut line.
So just one quick question, and then we'll go to Rocco for his last 4 in. In comparing teams like Wisconsin and Kentucky, I pulled up both their resumes just to kind of scroll through and looking at the schedules here. And to me, they both have a great win, like at Marquette for Wisconsin, Tennessee for Kentucky. I think Wisconsin has some other like a second tier of wins that are probably a bit better than Kentucky has. But you mentioned the Tyler Wall injury for Wisconsin as something that will be discussed. Does that go the other way with a team like Kentucky, where, I guess, just for example, Severe Wheeler went down and this team got a lot better for a couple weeks? Does that warrant mention the same way an injury where a player's out and the team got worse does? Or do you just write that off like, oh, we can't give them credit for that?
That's probably pretty tough to give credit for. A little cold-blooded to give them credit for too, probably. Although I wouldn't go so far as to say it's not a point that might come up in the committee room, right? Like, while how they've played in the last X amount of games doesn't matter now the way that it did some number of years ago. I do think it's fair, if I'm in the committee room and I'm trying to make a case that Kentucky should be in the field, I think it's completely reasonable to sit there and say, hey, look, they've made some changes. They're playing better. Maybe not point directly at, hey, this guy getting hurt made them a better team. But I do think you can talk about changes they made personnel wise and different things like that might have a factor. So I don't know that directly, but it would certainly be a talking point. And if the committee is doing their due diligence to monitor the conferences and teams as they should, it's something that should come up. It's just a matter of how much weight each person might put on something like that.
Okay. Yeah. And for the record, Severe did play 33 minutes in their last game. So that may not even be a talking point going forward, but I was very curious for that answer. Thank you for that. Rocco, let's go to you. Who are your last 4 in?
Yeah, it's the same mix as Andy's, just a little different order. So it's a lot of fun. Wisconsin actually, after regrading them this morning, popped up to the top of the list of these 4, but they're still going to Dayton in this bracket. I've got Kentucky next, then Nevada, then West Virginia. So Andy did a fantastic job breaking down the reasons. I would just add, the reason I put Wisconsin above the rest right now, I do like the fact that they have a collection of wins against the field, 3 of them away from home, and they're all pretty darn good. At Marquette, at Iowa, and a neutral win over USC down in the Bahamas, to go along with a nice home win over Maryland that gives them 4 against the field. That's a nice number in this part of the bubble world when doing the comparisons. They also did the win last night. Checked a couple other boxes that I think are, optically important. I don't know how important truly are to the committee. But to me, I really don't like putting a team in when they're under 500 against the top 3 quads all combined. This at least got them to 8-8. So it's kind of like, okay, I can feel a little better after that. And they've got 4 quad 1 wins. So that's another metric that's really in the Badgers' favor. I would also echo what Andy said about Nevada. You know, they've got those 4 really nice home wins against the 4 best teams in the Mountain West. Now they've got to, I think, go prove it. Maybe get one on the road. Just show us that you can do it. Right now, their best road win, San Jose State. I love you, Tim Miles, but I think Nevada's still got to do a little bit more on the road. So that's what they got left to do. They look good for today, but a lot of basketball left to be played. And then I would also just, on Kentucky's point, you asked him a question about the difference between them and Wisconsin. You know, Kentucky's only got the 1 quad 1 win. It's an amazing win at Tennessee, but it doesn't look good when they're just sitting there 1-6 in quad 1, and then you go on to the next column. They're 3-6 against the top 2A, 5-6 against the quad 2, and you got to get all the way to Q3 to get to an over 500 record. That little, probably seemed little road win at Ole Miss. That starts to build a better story because they still are under 500 on the road. That got them to 4 and 5. So there's a lot of these things where it probably doesn't seem like a lot to fans, but they do start to add up. So all these results are crucial.
Yeah. All right. So we also do have our consensus last 4 in here. We've got Rocco, we've got Andy, we've also got Lucas Harkins and Brad Waddell here. Here is the official fielding the 68s last 4 in. And gentlemen, you guys nailed it. These are the same teams. We might just move some puzzle pieces around, but that's why you are the best in the biz. Your 4 teams are the 4 teams. Let's move now to the first 4 out. We'll start with you this time, Rocco. Give us your first 4 out.
Yeah, so first 4 out, this is going to be a fun one. So we'll start it off with Utah State. You know, I kept looking at Utah State. I didn't think they were going to be this close to the field. Obviously, they had an awesome win against New Mexico earlier this week. But Utah State's just got a really bizarre profile in terms of the 2 quad 4 losses, which really, puts a little wrinkle in their story. But overall, they've won 14 games that matter. A lot of committee members I've talked to over the years, and Joe Lenardi, who I think a lot of people know, have told me that in a lot of cases, Q4 will get ignored when looking at a team's profile unless you've lost. And in their case, they've lost twice. But against everybody else, and the whole point of doing that is to see what you did against some decent competition. Utah State's 14-3, and that's easily the best record in the whole bubble picture. But they have some gaping holes. They don't have a Q1 or Q2 road win. So it's a fascinating profile. They're also a team in general. I enjoy watching that offense. They hum. When they get humming, they're a tough team. I think they could advance in the tournament if they can get in. That's a whole different topic. So we'll move on to the next team, which is Texas A&M. That's a team I actually had in on Monday. They take a loss to Arkansas by 11, and they were barely squeezing in the field to begin with. That loss kind of threw off some other numbers. I still think the Aggies are close, but I've got them second out. Pretty straightforward answer on that one. Oklahoma State's an interesting one. A really nice Bedlam road win. I think they're, between them and West Virginia, they're both playing this 500 game that Andy mentioned earlier, where I think they're both sitting at 13-9 today. No team has ever been selected in history to not be at least 2 games over, and even that's pretty rare. I think it's only happened a couple times, maybe once. So you're going to want to be, if you're the Pokes, the Sooners, or the Mountaineers, they're all in this situation. Somebody's got to emerge from that pack. So today it's West Virginia. I've got the Oklahoma schools out, but if you're an Oklahoma or Oklahoma State fan, feel free to just insert your name there if you're the team that comes out of this mess at the end. But I think between the 3, 1 out of those 3 seems and feels right. So Oklahoma State's third out. My fourth one's pretty interesting because in my bracket, I actually have Hofstra as the Colonial representative. They beat Charleston head-to-head. They're tied for first, and that puts Charleston in the at-large pool. Pretty interesting conversation. Their net number is not strong. They're like 69th, I think, right now. Their other metrics like KenPom and others are near the 80s. So it doesn't seem to fit the quote-unquote ideal at-large bid profile, but they do have a strength of record 44th. And when you look at the big board, we're usually taking like the top 46 in before we get to the auto bids. So that actually, I think, would get a very heavy debate on Charleston if we were in that scenario come March. Now, you have to remember, if Charleston actually goes into the at-large pool. They'll have to lose again in their conference tournament. But at the same time, there's a couple more wins they could get, like Towson. And if they did lose to Hofstra, again, Hofstra's a top 100 team. So the Charleston Cougars still in the mix. They've only lost 3 times all year. I don't know how you can totally ignore a team that good. So I've got them in the last 4 out, or first 4 out.
I'm glad you brought up Charleston because I had a note on both them and Florida Atlantic that I wanted to pick your brain on. So let's just dive in a little more to Charleston before we throw it over to Andy. Looking at the schedule, I mean, it's just the conference schedule at this point. You would expect them to run the table given on the team that they are, but now they've lost 2 straight. Suddenly winning 7 games to close the season feels a little more daunting than it may have a week ago for Pat Kelsey's team. What's your gut say, Rocco? Do they need to win out? And even if they win out, if they lose again to Hofstra, is it done for them? What does your gut say?
Yeah, I think if they went out and lost again to Hofstra in the CAA title game, man, that would just be gut-wrenching if they didn't get in. Because at that point, they're probably looking at a 29-4 record. I'm imagining they would have to win a quarterfinal and a semi without memorizing their bracket. But 29-4, and they got wins over Virginia Tech, Kent State, Colorado State, Davidson, Richmond, like upper major teams, right? So I have a good feeling that maybe Dayton's the perfect place to put a team like that. But I do think you look at the rest of their schedule, that they're really only noteworthy games are Towson and UNC Wilmington. Wilmington's really kind of fallen off the last few weeks, and Towson's playing great basketball. They could certainly trip up there. The other problem with the CAA, I watch this level of basketball quite a bit. Teams like Elon and Hampton are suddenly just playing feisty as hell. So they could easily get clipped by one of those guys. So it's not going to be easy for the Cougars. That's my point. But I do think if the Cougars can get to the finish line, get to like 28, 29 wins, they've got a real case.
You mentioned Wilmington and Towson. Both those games are at home, just for record for Charleston, so that helps. And then quickly, I do want to ask on Florida Atlantic, because I feel like the same sort of concept applies. They suffer their first conference loss of the season to UAB last night at UAB. That's a tough game. I mean, I don't think that's anything that people would say, oh, that's a bad loss or anything like that. They've only got 2 losses on the season now. They haven't lost the second one in a row, the same way Charleston did. But do they have a little buffer? Do you have Florida Atlantic more firmly in the field if they were to lose another game?
I do, because their Florida win is getting better with age, and that's a true road win. So their Florida right now is 41st. That's 1 spot away. Florida keeps playing well from being a quad 1A. It's barely quad 1B. Not that that's super important. But right now, you're just looking at a body of work that's a 19-2 D1 record. If you ignore Q4, like I said earlier, you're still looking at a 10-2 ball club. And the team they lost to last night, UAB. I was there in Boca when they beat them the first time. So it's not like it's some team that they couldn't pass the test. They've passed that test before. I think the committee talks about those types of things, especially in this scenario. If they stay around 2 or 3 losses, they're going to get in for sure. I think FAU definitely has more leash as well, just because their metrics are a little stronger. Their resume is extremely strong. They have a 19th strength of resume right now. There's no way they're not getting in if they stay in the top 25 or even top 30 of that, in my opinion. So, they don't want their predictives to slip that much. Like Kempon, they're still like around 40th. Sagarin, they're down near 60th. So you're going to get selected based on your resume, not your predictives in most cases. And I think, barring any disasters like a UTSA loss, who's absolutely at the bottom of that league, FAU should be able to hang on, but we'll see. It's a tough league.
Yeah, no, we've had that debate on After Dark multiple times this year of like, who's your Cinderella if you had to look ahead. And it often comes down to pitting these two against each other, especially when they were both on such, big winning streaks for a while, up to 18, 19 games in a row. Now they both suffer a loss. It's interesting to sort of place where they're at. And it's good to know, quite frankly, that Florida Atlantic has a little bit of a buffer, because it would be a shame if that team somehow was kept out of the field. All right, let's go to you, Andy. Give us your first 4 out as of today.
Yeah, the other one quick thing on Florida Atlantic to finish. At this point, they've already played UAB twice. They've already played North Texas twice. So they went 3-1 in those games. And really, when you look at the class of that league, it's those teams. Now, that doesn't mean that they might not trip up against somebody else, but relatively speaking, their schedule is easier as you move down the stretch. But my last four, there's actually only we finally broke from consensus here. I only had one of the same teams that Rocco did, so at least we get a little debate finally. 40 minutes in, we finally don't agree on something. So, but Oklahoma State is the team that's in both. They were the really the only one of these that I think I seriously considered to have in the field. With them, you've got those 3 quad 1 wins. The sweep of Oklahoma certainly helps for bubble purposes. They've beaten Iowa State at home. So that part is pretty solid. They do have a Q3 loss, which was by 1 point to Southern Illinois. So that's one thing that maybe doesn't work in their favor. So we'll see how they fare coming up, but they're at least kind of right there for me. Then I pandered to Dagan and put Seton Hall in here, which just to make sure I keep my spot on the show. No, but they've been playing well of late. They're up to 3-5 in quad 1, 2-3 in quad 2. They do have a quad 3 loss to Siena on a neutral floor, but they've got a strong non-conference strength of schedule. They're back to 6-6 in road and neutral games after beating St. John's this week at St. John's. And so, you look at them, they've beaten UConn, they won at Rutgers, which is a huge win. They beat Memphis on a neutral floor. So they've got a few really quality wins at the top. And for them, they've got a couple very winnable games in their next 4, starting with DePaul coming up over the weekend, but then they host Creighton. That would be another chance to get a huge win. They go to Villanova, come back to host Georgetown. So a couple of those you don't want to stub your toe in, but just in the spirit of trying to win games, a couple of those should help there. Penn State, I had next. They're a tough one for me. The non-conference strength of schedule isn't particularly good. They're 3-6 in road neutral games. I think they only have 1 true road win, which was a solid one at Illinois. But otherwise, they've beaten IU, they've beaten Iowa at home, and then beaten Michigan as their next best win there. They don't have a Q3 or Q4 loss, which is great, but eventually they got to, I think, start to do a little bit more away from home to be able to offset some of the 277th ranked non-conference strength of schedule. Get a chance to do that by going to Nebraska next up for them. Then they host Wisconsin, go to Maryland, and host Illinois. So they're another team who's got a lot of opportunities coming up, as does pretty much everybody in the Big Ten, but gets a little dicey after that. And then Arizona State was the next one. I kind of got to this point. I think you could insert a number of teams there. I looked at some of the ones that Rocco had mentioned, looked a little bit at Florida, looked at Oklahoma as well, in addition to Utah State and Texas A&M that he mentioned. With Arizona State, you've got 6 quad 1 and 2 wins. You do have that Q4 loss at Texas Southern, and so that doesn't help. But they are 7-4 in road and neutral games, so that helps to stand out a little bit against other bubble teams there. Got the win against Creighton on a neutral floor, but they really need to start stacking some wins. And most of their they play 3 of the next 5 at home. Short of the game against Oregon over the weekend, not a ton of those are going to move the needle other than just to prevent disaster. So they're kind of hanging out there, but this is where there's just a bunch of teams in this area, all of whom you could poke holes in and are somewhat nondescript as you start looking at the resumes.
Yeah, we've gone over a bunch of different sorting tools, as I called them at the beginning of the show. 2 very important sorting tools in the Greg Waddell world of bracketology. Seton Hall ranks #1 in the country in coaches I want to see in the NCAA tournament, and Penn State ranks #1 in the country in players I want to see in the NCAA tournament. We need Shaheen Holloway and Jalen Pickett in the NCAA tournament. So Penn State, if you could just win a couple more road games, that would be lovely. Seton Hall, take care of business, please. Let's get you guys off the last, or not even the last 4 in, the first 4 out right now. You've got work to do, and I want to see you get there. All right, let's go to the chat. We haven't gone to the chat yet in the show. We're coming up on 45 minutes here. Dagan, do we have anything popping off in the chat for these guys?
Hold on, Greg. You forgot something. You forgot our consensus.
I forgot I'm so excited.
Yeah, no, you're excited. You're excited. There's only one reason I want to show this. It's because our buddy Yuli just showed up in the chat. I just wanted to see that beautiful pirate logo one more time. So here's our consensus stuff. First 4 out.
I'm surprised you wanted to show that your team was out.
That's okay. You know why? Because a week ago we weren't even in the conversation. So I'm all for it.
Yeah, sadly, I would kill to be in the first 4 out right now with my Michigan Wolverines. So I don't blame you there.
But yes, we do have some questions in the chat, and I will ask some. Can UCLA get up to the 1 line? Yes or no?
I would say I'd say it's possible. They'll need some help. Obviously, if they win out, they'll host the Arizona schools here at Pauley. I'm down the street. That's why I keep saying here. But yeah, I think they would need some help. Obviously, win the Pac-12. They've been winning the league all year long. So win the Pac-12, get that regular season title, get that tournament title. In bracketology, we call that the double. And so if they have the double from a power conference, they'll certainly be considered for a one. And at that point, as we've talked about with everything else, they'll be compared to whoever's left out there. But I think if the teams above them stayed as hot as they are now, might be too much for UCLA to overcome.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, right now, if you look, they certainly don't have a bad loss, but their best wins are at Maryland, which is the only team to win at Maryland this year. So something to be said for that. Beating Kentucky on a neutral floor and then beating USC at home. I mean, those are the only teams they've beaten that are in the tournament conversation right now. If Oregon maybe plays their way at least a little bit closer to the discussion, that win at home helps you a little bit. Plus, they travel there pretty soon. But yeah, they're one that when you start looking at that wins versus the field, it does not reflect favorably on them, even though they don't have bad losses.
Exactly.
If UConn wins out, we don't even need to talk about that. We can just talk about how high is UConn's ceiling this season? What seed can they get? How high?
I love if UConn wins out. What a qualifier.
Well, I'll say this. I think, a lot of UConn people I've interacted with in recent weeks are pretty bummed. Obviously, the way they're playing is not good. But it's a body of work, right? And they've got wins over Alabama and Iowa State that still matter quite a bit. So if they are able to get it re-sparked and go, take off again, they're going to pick up some big wins in the Big East. I don't have their schedule pulled up in front of me, but right now they've been kind of stuck in this 15 to 17 range for me, which is borderline 4 seed, 5 seed. It's hard to push them lower down because the wins that they already got earlier in the year are so amazing. And so if they're able to build on that, you can see them easily getting back up to the 3, maybe even a two seed conversation.
Yeah, if you look at their schedule, they've got, their teams, the ones they play against teams lowest in the league standings, or 3 of the 4 are on the road. They go at Georgetown, and then their last 3 games are at St. John's, DePaul at home, at Villanova. But in the middle of that, you play Marquette again, you play Seton Hall at home, Providence at home, and at Creighton. So that's 4, that's 4 tournament teams that you could get that you have opportunities to beat. I think if they can avoid stubbing their toe against some of these lesser teams, certainly the Georgetowns and DePauls of the world, I think, to what you said, showing some signs that they've righted the ship a little bit in conjunction with all those great wins. Like, those don't go away. It isn't how do you play the last 10 games? What's your record the last 10 games? Like, those wins still matter. So they've got a pretty high floor because of those wins. It just doesn't matter what the ceiling could be. Feels like realistically games they could win, feels like a 3 maybe is the ceiling. I think if they would win out in that hypothetical scenario that was dismissed very quickly, they probably could get themselves to the 2 line, I would guess, depending upon what happens around them.
I'm sure Rob's watching, so I couldn't let him have that if they win out sentiment.
I figured the question was from Rob Doster.
No, it was not. It was not. If it was, I wouldn't have asked it. We all know that. So, can you guys see the Big 12 ending up with 6 protected seeds?
Yeah, that's a good question. I keep looking at that. It could happen because the way things have played out thus far in Big 12 play, and what are we, about 12 games in or so, give or take? There has been, some cannibalism across the top 6. And if they keep cannibalizing each other, that's just going to keep them up. So just take turns winning at each other's buildings or protecting home court, a mix of that every week. I don't see how it changes too much. TCU is the team that's got the most volatility because they have a loss to Northwestern State in Quad 4. So if the Frogs start to slip a little bit, it's going to be a little easier to knock them off the protected seed area. But I think teams like Baylor, Texas, Kansas have a really solid footing. Kansas State's the one where maybe they just haven't done a lot of road damage. Well, they did win at Texas and Baylor. I should take that back. But they don't have as many wins against the field as the other teams I've mentioned. So maybe Kansas State's capable of slipping. But I could certainly see it if the cannibalism continues.
Yeah, I tend to think it probably ends up closer to 5 when it's all said and done. But if those teams really, you're starting to see that a little bit. Oklahoma State's really the one that's kind of in the middle, but the conference has started to separate a little bit where you've got, those 6 that are over 500. Then you got Oklahoma State at 4 and 5, and then it drops off to West Virginia, Oklahoma at 2 and 7 each. So if you really see all those teams just beat up on the bottom 4, which is probably arguably the best bottom 4 of any conference that you'd find out there, But if those teams really start getting beaten up by the top ones, and to your point, Rocco, they trade wins with one another among that group of 6, I definitely think that's possible. The Miles injury for TCU doesn't help their case to survive some of those kinds of games, and just becomes another injury to take into account as well as you start thinking about that. So it seems like 5 is more likely than 6, but I think there's a chance if they really start to see that separation get more and more pronounced as you go through the rest of the season.
I have one quick follow-up for you guys because it's bringing me back to our last 4 and first 4 out conversations. But we had West Virginia and Wisconsin in the mix there. And I'm just envisioning like West Virginia right now, 2-7 in the Big 12. We talk about how they're at the bottom of the barrel. They might just keep losing to these 7 teams ahead of them, even though their quality metrics are pretty damn good. And then you've got a Wisconsin team who, like, it wouldn't be shocking if they crack 500 in Big 10 play, just given some of those teams they're going to play a couple more times this season. Like, does that, at the end of the year, if you're evaluating 2 resumes that are similar like that, like, does the nod just go to a team that even if they might finish like 6-14 in conference play, they had to go play Kansas twice and Texas twice instead of what the Big Ten's going through?
I think you still got to be at least in shooting distance of 500, right? Like if they lose that many games, I know you're just kind of throwing out hypotheticals, but like even let's say they go 7-11, right? Like they end up with, that gives them 13 losses in total. They're 18-13 going into the Big 12 tournament. You really probably need, maybe you could survive a loss, but if you lose your first game, you're 18-14, like that becomes pretty difficult. I think at that point, the losses almost just become too much. And their schedule is just horrific. It is the stuff of nightmares where they've got 2 games left against Iowa State. They go to Kansas. They've got Texas on the road, Baylor on the road, Kansas State at home. So I mean, like they have not yet. Maybe I'm doing the math wrong here, but if we really think of those like top 4 or 5 teams, they haven't played as many games against those as other teams might have. So I think it's fairly unlikely. And the other challenge with the Big Ten in particular to compare to, the schedule is so unbalanced that and the committee says they're going to look at conference record for a variety of reasons, but that would be one of them to me. If they go, Wisconsin does well in the Big Ten, but they only played Purdue once and, draw out of a hat who you think the next big, top Big Ten teams are, and they played a bunch of those only once, you could rack up a bunch of conference wins and it's not empty. They're not empty wins. They matter, but it might matter a little bit less in the Big 12, where at least they play a true round robin. There's a bit more to be said for that. And if everybody did that, then maybe that would take that into account a little bit more, but that's just not, unfortunately, the way these conferences are set up.
Right. Yeah. And we saw it last year with the ACC. Wake Forest dominated 13-5, had a terrible non-conference strength of schedule, and it still did them in. A lot of those 13 wins they got in the ACC were not against very competitive teams, just because it was one of the worst ACCs in history. And here in the Big 10 and Big 12, like Big 10, as Andy mentioned, with the unbalanced schedule, Wisconsin specifically, they do get a home game against Purdue. Like you win that, you're probably well above the cut line. They'll also get some big home opportunities with Rutgers, Iowa, and Northwestern all coming to town. So the Badgers just take care of the home business from here. I think they're in really good shape. Their road games are against much less competition, at least teams out of the field, that being Michigan, Penn State, Nebraska, and Minnesota. So Wisconsin just got, I think from here, just take care of your home business. You're going to get there. And then the larger point, you mentioned West Virginia, Greg. I think it applies to not only them, but both Oklahomas, as I kind of hinted at earlier. You're playing this 500 game, and if you end up 6-12 in the league, you're still, it's not part of your team sheet or your resume, but you're compounding all that losing. It's going to throw off your quad records. You're not going to win a lot of comparisons that way. There's probably not a lot of combinations or any that are going to get you above the cut line when you're compared to teams from other leagues. And that's where the 500 game becomes the most important thing for those 3 particular schools. Last year, perfect example, Iowa State had a better resume because they went 12-0 non-league. They go 7-11 in the league, but they got in pretty safely. Oklahoma, they had more of a dicey non-conference schedule, and they end up going 7-11. Porter Moser was not happy that they didn't get in, but they weren't anywhere near the field, in my opinion. So there's 2 different types of 7-11s, depending on what your non-conference looks like and the actual teams you beat in the conference.
It's really fascinating because I'm sure there's going to be some on the odd side out of the Big 12, specifically given how good the top 6 teams in that league are this year. But as someone who's watched so much Big 10, like I would just love to know, what if we threw Wisconsin in West Virginia or Oklahoma's shoes? What if we threw Northwestern, teams that we feel pretty confident will earn their way in from protecting home court in the Big 10 down the stretch? Like, man, let's just flip. Let's say the challenge that's left. They got to go at Texas, at Baylor, at Kansas, Iowa State, and still find 5 wins in those final 7 games or whatever it is. Just very interesting. So I'll be keeping my eyes on that just as a fan as we get into the stretch run here. Dagan, do we have any final questions that we want before we jump to games to watch?
No, since you're pushing up against an hour here, I'll let you guys do your games to watch here.
Perfect. All right, guys, let's go around the horn. Just give me your biggest game to watch. How about that? And then we'll wrap the show here. Let's start with you, Rocco. What do you got?
Well, it's tough. I think they're all kind of interesting. Here's a really interesting one that I'm looking at. And we haven't really talked about this team yet. Clemson is going to host Miami. Now, both teams are in today, of course. Clemson's technically still the ACC representative, but they lose this home game to Miami. Take a look at this real quick. They'll be out of first place in the ACC for all intents and purposes, as long as Virginia handles Virginia Tech. That, again, is another bubble opportunity for the Hokies. But if Clemson goes into the bubble field, the at-large field, I think they're kind of on thin ice. They go squarely on the bubble for me with their 2 quad 4 losses. They actually took another tough loss to BC. I think that's fallen in Q3 earlier this week. So I think that's a really important game for Clemson.
Andy, what about you?
Yeah, there's a huge slate of games on Saturday. I will throw out that was a good one from Rocco. I'll throw out 2 real quick ones. One is Florida at Kentucky. Can Florida build on what they did against Tennessee? They're kind of in that next group of teams out. They've got to find ways to get some more wins. That would obviously go a long way. And for Kentucky, at least it would be another win that maybe makes them a little bit safer against the team that's there. And then Gonzaga St. Mary's. St. Mary's metrics darling in a number of ways. Like, can they actually can they beat Gonzaga? They've had success against them in the past, but can they beat them to in some ways validate what's the net and some of the other metrics are saying about them? So that one becomes big. And really, Gonzaga is running out of chances to get impressive wins as well, to really push their way up toward they're in that kind of 3-4 mix right now. Can they push their way up the seed list a little bit? Getting a win at St. Mary's would go a long way toward doing that.
Yeah, I'm glad you just touched on my one game to watch that I was going to fire at you guys, and that's Gonzaga St. Mary's. Is there a world where Gonzaga pushes back up to the 1 line even? Like, if they win out from here, sweep St. Mary's, win the conference, how far off are they? Because it's been, 3-4 years now that we've seen a Gonzaga team atop the sport on that 1 line?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'll be covering the game, so follow along on the live coverage. But yeah, like the Gonzaga profile, the way they've gotten there before, obviously big non-conference wins, dominating like the KenPom, the Nets, all the predictives. If Gonzaga can go and play a whole month's worth of basketball like they played last year, I don't fully foresee that, but they played great last night in their Santa Clara win. Maybe they do get back up towards like the top 5 of the net and the top 5 of the KenPoms. And from a seeding perspective, if you throw in 3 wins against St. Mary's, they still have to play twice in the regular season. They usually play each other in the championship game as well, the tournament. That would go a long ways to probably getting them close to a 2. They would have to be strongly considered, I think, for a 2 in that scenario.
And you agree?
Yeah, 2 feels like the ceiling. I mean, if you assume those 3 wins, it'd all be quad 1, which I think they would be, barring St. Mary's making a precipitous fall down the rankings. That put them 6-3 if you look at what it is now, 11-3 in the top 2 quadrants. But that LMU loss still hurts. And as we talk about, we use the quad 3 loss against Houston to a certain extent in the 1 seed conversation, and I think that certainly is at play here, especially with metrics that are a little bit worse than some of the other teams that are there right now. So yeah, 2 feels like the ceiling as of now if they can rip off those wins, and if they play St. Mary's in the WCC finals, which it would seem highly likely this year, like it is most every other year.
Right.
Yeah, that's going to be a fun one, guys. St. Mary's, Ken Palm's got St. Mary's winning that game by 5 points against Gonzaga this weekend. I will be very excited to watch that. And we hope you enjoyed watching this as much as I will enjoy watching Gonzaga St. Mary's this weekend. This was Fielding the 68, our bracketology show. Again, every Monday, every Friday, 5 p.m. Eastern. You can hear from guys like Rocco Miller, Andy Bottoms, Brad Waddell, Lucas Harkins. We have the official bracket that's going to be sent out right after the show wraps tonight. So keep an eye out for that on Twitter, on Instagram, on all of the Field of 68 social media channels. Gentlemen, it's always a pleasure talking bracketology with you. We'll see you guys next week. For Andy, for Rocco, my name is Greg.